Welcome back to Convert a Warm, Cheerful Web Design to HTML and CSS. So we've done a lot so far. We've designed the site, we created the markup, we sliced the PSD, and I taught you how to work with the 960 grid system. In this chapter, and I'm going to separate this into multiple chapters because it's a lot of work, we're going to focus on the layout and the header section. So let's go into Espresso. And here's our index.html, and now I'm going to open up our blank style.css file, and this is where we'll get started. So the first step is to take care of the HTML stuff. So I'm switching just for the CSS portion of this series to Espresso, and the reason is because it offers a very helpful live preview option, and this will show you a preview of the site as you're editing it. So what I can do is I can take that and pull it out, and then I can go into our style.css and push that to the left. Okay, so the first step is to work on our HTML5 stuff. So I'm going to use dividers. Now what these do is they allow you to easily divide your content so that down the road it's easier to come back. So I'll say HTML5. And what we'll do here is go through all of our elements. Section, header, footer, the new HTML5 elements aside, article, nav, that should be fine for now. And I'm going to make sure that the browsers by default display them as block level elements because that's what they are. Not all browsers have default stylings for these elements. Okay, and next I want to do the body, and I'm going to apply that background. So by default, if we go into our design in Photoshop, you can see that it has a background color of this right here, and this will be the main background color. So I'm going to copy that and come back to our project and paste that in. That's all converting a PSD is, copying colors from Photoshop and values and bringing them over to your style sheet. And then next I want to reference that background image that we cut out. So I can do image, and if we open up the images folder, we could do bg.jpg. But the only problem is we're within a CSS folder, so we need to go out of the CSS folder into the images folder and to that file. So I do that by doing .. /. And now you can see that background showing through, but there's still one more problem in that it's repeating vertically and horizontally. If I want no repeat, I type no repeat, but in this case I want it to repeat horizontally, so I do repeat X. So now if I go into Firefox and I refresh the page, now we have our background. And we might want to work on it. It looks like I can see that repeating nature pretty well, but we can come back to that. Alright, so now let's work on some default styling. So all anchor tags, I don't want any text decoration by default, so none. And I'm going to get rid of that blue color, and we're going to switch that to black. Next, when we hover over an anchor tag, I'm going to set the text decoration to underline. And now, when I hover over them, they get that underline. Okay, the next step is for the paragraph tags, I'm going to set a font size of 12 pixels and a line height of 18 pixels. And the reason I'm doing this is because if we come in and we select some text and we go into the window character palette tool, or I can click right here, you'll see that the font size is Verdana and it's 12 pixels and 18 pixels. So I can also say font size Verdana, Helvetica, Arial, and then a fallback color. It's always good to set a fallback font. Refresh, and there we go. Alright, so the next step is do the heading tags. Now I could also place these within the typography style sheet, but they're all going to be grouped together eventually anyways. So here I'm going to set a different font family for these. Eventually we're going to be using a custom font, but for now we'll do Myriad Pro with a fallback of Helvetica, Arial, Sans Serif. And then later we'll come back and update this with our new font. Next, I want all fonts to be uppercase, and we can use text transform uppercase. So if you go back to our style sheet or our PSD, you can see very often the text is all uppercase, as you can see right there. So we can make that happen by doing text transform and then move that to uppercase. Okay, and then the last step is he doesn't use a lot of bold, so we'll set the default font weight to bold for the heading. Or I'm sorry, font weight to normal. There you go. Okay, so the next step is for the heading 3 tags. That is going to be the bluish color that you see right here. Okay, and it also has some text shadow above it. So we can simply grab the eyedropper tool, select the color, and make sure that we set it to that color. So I can say color to that, And if I refresh, and if I come down now, you'll see that that blue has been applied. So let's also take care of that text shadow. And text shadow is a CSS3 property and it accepts a handful of parameters. The first one is the x-axis offset. The next one is the y-axis. So if we want more of an underline, I can just push it down 1 pixel. And the third parameter is blur, and the fourth parameter is going to be the color. So we can just grab that right there. And then also we can see that the text shadow is coming above it. So in that case, why don't we push it to -1 pixel? So if we scroll down, hopefully you can see that taking shape. If I set it to red, you'll really see it right there. Okay, but subtlety is key. Okay, so the next step is to set a font size as well. And I'm also going to set a line height equal to that exact value for this particular case. Okay, let's continue on. Now these are our base general styles. So why don't we style that accordingly with a header. And we'll say CSS divider. It's always important to use some form of text expander. And we'll call it general. That way I can easily come back to this section if we need to. Now I'm going to go into list items and I'm going to reset that default 0 pixels worth that all default browsers add. If I get rid of that, you'll see what's going on there. So I'll zero that out. And I'm also going to get rid of any default list styling because generally that's going to be applied within the article. Alright, so that looks pretty good for now. Why don't we also do one last thing to the unordered list. Set overflow to hidden, and the reason we do this is because invariably you'll float all the elements within an unordered list, and that causes the container to take up no space seemingly. So overflow hidden is a kind of a hack, a little trick to force it to contain any floated children. So we'll go over that in more detail later. Alright, so let's continue, and now we're going to style our default containers. And if I set a background color of red and I refresh, you can kind of see what we're working with, each of those wrapping containers. So what I want to do here is apply padding left of 5 pixels and the same thing to the padding right section. There we go. And now if we come down, let's create a quick helper class and we'll place that within our general styles area and we'll call it rounded. And this is a helper that'll simply apply some rounded corners. And we can use the vendor prefixes Moz border radius, it's 5 pixels. And then we need to take care of WebKit. And then we also need to do the official form, which the new version of Chrome and IE9 will support. That way then, rather than having to repeat this over and over and over, we can just add a class and it'll do it for us and it'll save on the size of our style sheet. Alright, so now with this done, let's work on our header. And we'll call this header, that's fine. In the header element, I'm going to give it a background color so you can see what we're working with. I'm going to make sure it contains any of its floats, and I'm also going to make sure that the text within it is white. So if I come into Firefox, refresh, you'll see that the text here is white, but these links are still black. And that's because these are anchor tags, and we specified at the top that anchor tags should be black right here. So if we want to override that, we need to go into it and say header first. Well, we'll come to that. First, let's go to the header h1 tag, and we want to style what you see right here. So right off the bat, I see that it's white, and then it has another little text shadow of this color. So I'm going to grab that, and we'll come back to Espresso, and header h1, padding top of 30 pixels, and then that text shadow of 0, -1 pixel, 0 worth of blur, and then that color. And I'm also going to set the font size to 30 pixels. And let's come back to Firefox and refresh the page. And let's get rid of that nasty red. And now you can see it. So how did we get those values? And if we come here, the ruler tool is going to be your best friend when converting designs. So you can go right here to ruler and just measure. And it doesn't have to be exact, but try to get close. And you can see right here, the height is around 38 pixels. So when I measured it, I came closer to 30 pixels, so I made the padding top equal to that value. Now the font size, if we come back, we can click right here, and you'll see the font size is 30.30 pixels. So that's where we're getting those values. Now we want the color to be white, but again, if we set color to white, and I scroll to the top, that's not going to take effect. And the reason is because we need to instead style the anchor tag within the heading 1 tag. And now you'll see that's taking shape. So at this point we can begin working on the navigation area. So again, CSS divider, and we'll call this nav. From time to time I'm going to paste in things, and it's because it would take a really long time to do this from scratch. So we'll go over each one. We'll begin with header nav. So what nav does is when I apply overflow hidden, that'll force it to contain any floats within it. We went over that. Next, I'm floating the navigation area to the left because that's where, if I zoom out, that's where it occurs right here. It's over to the left. Next, I set the margin top to 5 pixels, and the reason is if I set a background color of red and I remove this, you'll notice that it's a little too high, so I want to push it down by 5 pixels so it perfectly takes up that brown background. Next, a cool technique is if you set a height and a line height equal to that same value, it'll make the text display vertically centered. So if I get rid of that, you'll see that the text doesn't display correctly, not to mention that we haven't floated the text. So if we keep that in, it'll be vertically centered. So next, let's float the list items within it. So in here, we float each of the list items, and that's what makes them show in a line. And then by default, I'm going to zero out any margins, but we don't really need to do that because we already did it right here. So don't repeat yourself if you don't have to. And then to provide some spacing, we're going to set the margin right equal to about 25 pixels worth. Now, again, we can't apply a color to these list items and it won't take effect. That needs to be applied directly to the anchor tag. So we'll paste that in right here. Now, to get these values, again, we go to the top and we can measure them. And we can see the font size is 16 pixels. So we paste that in here. The color is white, and we paste it in here. And again, if you zoom in all the way, there's some text shadow at the bottom. So we can measure that, grab that color, and apply that text shadow, push it down one, and paste in that value. And now you get that really nice looking text shadow that you see right there. Next, we need to style for the selected item and when you hover over it. And this is a common mistake that designers make is they design a site and they don't tell the coder what should happen when you hover over a list item. You need to allow for that too. So I'm going to have to do this on my own. I'll paste something in here. And what I'll do is I'm going to extend this just so we have a little bit more room temporarily. Okay, a lot of stuff here. Well, the first step is we say when you hover over an anchor tag or when an anchor tag has a class of selected, and that would be the current page. So why don't we go ahead and add one right now. And we can go to the top and we'll say home, give it a class of selected as you see right here. Okay. Well, what are we going to do? Well, the first step is give a background color of kind of a bluish color. So now you'll see, I'm sorry, a yellowish color. But I see two things right off the bat. There needs to be some padding, and also there doesn't need to be a background of yellow and an underline. Okay, so get rid of the border, and then we add some padding all around it. All right. Next, do you see if I hover over one, you see that twitch? And that's because when you hover over it, padding is being applied, and that's forcing items to the right. So why don't we instead take this padding and bring it over, and we'll set it by default to the anchor tag. That way when you hover over it, there won't be additional spacing issues. Like so. But now you see how that padding is also affecting every anchor, and we don't want that. We only want this information to style the anchor tags that are within the nav element. So I'm going to specify nav. That way it won't affect our logo. And refresh the page, and now you can see that right there. So let's come back, and now we get rid of that, but I'm still seeing that underline, and that's because we have border bottom rather than text decoration. So make sure we get rid of that. Refresh, and that looks a lot better. Now this background should be rounded. So why don't we go ahead and use that helper class, and we could also do something like rounded, but then when working dynamically you'd have to add 2 classes. So how about this one time we just go ahead and hard-code it in. WebKit border radius 3 pixels, and then we'll do Mozilla and the official form. If I refresh, now those are rounded. Pretty cool. Next, let's come in and apply a highlight. So I'm going to set a border color of 1 pixel solid, and this is just a lighter shade of yellow. And now can you see it just adds a little bit of a highlight. But again, now when you hover, we're adding a border of 1 pixel, and on the left and right that adds up to 2 pixels. So you see how the text to the right gets pushed. We don't want that. So let's go ahead and fix that. And we can do that by saying when you hover over, set the margin right to -2 pixels. And if I hover over that, now that fixes it, because we're compensating for the increased width by setting the margin right to offset that. There you go. Looks good. And now the final step here is we're applying that text shadow to the text itself, because when you hover over it, I'm going to change it a little bit and make it a little darker. And of course, let's make sure that it goes down a little bit. There you go. And it's just going to be slightly different when you hover over it. But now we have a nice looking nav. So let's take advantage of some CSS3 transitions. People will tell you you can't use it now. I promise you, you can. It's just a way of adding enhancements for the browsers that support it. Right now, this looks fine. So let's do WebKit transition. And we're going to transition what? Everything for now. Over the course of how long? 1 second. So what this will do is when you hover over an element, it's going to try to transition as much as possible. If I hover over it in Firefox, nothing happens because we're applying a WebKit specific prefix. So instead, let's grab this and view it in Chrome. And now, did you see when I refreshed, we have some animations happening? Okay. And when I hover over this, it's fading in, so we're getting some color fades, but also the borders are fading. We don't want to transition everything. All I want to transition here is going to be the background. So I'll change that to background. And 1 second is kind of long. Let's do ½ a second. Now when I refresh and I hover over it, sure enough, we get that nice background. Looks good. And then when we hover off or move off, it just goes off, and that's fine. We're okay with that. So now our nav menu looks really good. Now this will work for WebKit, but we also need to do the official version as well as what maybe Mozilla and Opera might allow for. So it requires some more work, but we'll do O and Moz. So we have WebKit browsers, Mozilla for Firefox, O for Opera, and then the official version when it's implemented in all the browsers. Okay, so the next step, if we come back to Photoshop, is to work on this header social area, these icons. So we'll go right here, and we'll create a new divider, and we'll say social icons. And I'll paste in a new bit, and head social. So this, if we go into index.html, and we scroll down, you'll see that we have our menu, and then we have these links right here. So the first step is I want to position them absolutely. And secondly, I want to position them absolutely all the way at the top, pretty much all the way at the top, and then all the way to the right. And what that does for me now is it pushes them all the way over here. But notice how it's being positioned in relation to the window, not to this container. So how can we fix that? And we do that by making sure that the container 24, no matter what, has a positioning context of relative, and that'll make sure that anything that's absolutely positioned within it will be positioned in relation to that. So it's a little confusing. Once you get your head around it, it makes perfect sense. And now that's pushed over. Okay, so let's continue on. Next, of course, we want the list items to display in a line rather than vertically. So if I refresh, now those get pushed over like we would expect. Now let's add some fun features to these icons themselves. So we'll come right at the bottom and paste this in. And here we're targeting those icon images. And we begin by floating them to the left. And notice how they're pushed right up against each other. Let's give them some room. So each one will be pushed a little bit. And then margin bottom, we can probably get rid of that for the time being. And then finally, I'm adding a WebKit transition to them. So let's see what that does right now. Okay, by default, WebKit transition isn't doing anything, but it is giving us some space here. The transition will be applied when we hover over the image. So when you hover over an image, we're going to apply a high border radius, and this is going to make them into like circles. So let's save that and come into Chrome, and when I hover over that, you'll see that they turn into little circles. Pretty neat. Cool. So let's come back into Espresso, but there's one thing here is I think it's probably not the best practice to apply transitions to everything if you don't have to. Instead, you want to apply it to the properties that are being animated. So why don't we instead change this to WebKit border radius, and now if I refresh, that's still going to animate, and we're not applying transitions to every single thing, right? So we'll do that again here for Mozilla. and here for border radius, because that's all we ever want to do. And even if we update these elements later, we're not going to have things transitioning that we don't want to. So let's come back to Photoshop. And now let's work on this form. So notice that the text seems to be somewhat bold and it has a text shadow, and then this input has a background icon as well as a gradient from top to bottom, and even it looks like maybe a little bit of a shadow on top. So a bunch of things to do here. I'm going to add a new divider and we'll say header form. And here we go and get the form and we float it all the way to the right and we apply some margin on top. So let's get rid of the margin for now. Refresh, and notice how it's right at the top. Let's add that margin top in. And if I refresh, that gets that vertically centered. Okay, that looks a lot better. But now we need to style that search, because remember, all of this is within a p tag, mostly for convenience. So now if we go into Espresso and I paste this in, first we take that text and we make it bold, and then we make all of the text uppercase, and then we apply a black shadow above the text, but just 1 pixel worth. And then next we disable the bottom margin of the p tag, which is there by default. And I'm also setting a positioning context just in case I want to position anything within it. So let's save that and refresh. And now you can see, if I zoom in a little bit more, the text is bold and you have a nice shadow behind it. Looks good. So now we need to style the input itself. So lots of stuff here, and we're going to go over each one. So we begin by, let's go ahead and get rid of this, and we begin by setting a background color. So what that does is it gives us this bluish color. But if we go back to our Photoshop file, you'll see that it's actually a gradient. If I select here, you'll see that the color, refer here, is going to be different going down. So we need to set a gradient. And rather than using an image slice, I'd rather use CSS gradients. Now CSS gradients have two different ways to do them. The first is WebKit's recommended way, and then the second is Mozilla's enhanced way, and which is what the W3 recommend. Let's do this one first for WebKit. We begin by specifying a handful of parameters. The first one is going to be what type of gradient is it? It's linear. And then the next one is going to be where does the gradient begin and where should it end? So here I've specified begin at the left bottom. So top to bottom essentially. Now, the next parameter is what color should it begin? So all you have to do is grab that color with the color selector tool, grab that tool, come back and paste it in, and then do the exact same thing for the bottom, and then paste it in right here. And that's it. And now you have your gradient. So refresh, and now it's pretty small, but if I zoom in all the way, you'll see that we have a nice gradient there. And that's easy with just CSS. But now Mozilla enhanced this, and it made it better. So it did Moz linear gradient. And what it did was, rather than left top, left bottom, if you specify top, that'll be enough for it. And then the second parameter is going to be the color to start with. And the third parameter is going to be the color to end with. And it's that easy. So now if I go into Firefox, refresh, it gets that gradient as well. So the official version is what Mozilla recommended. So originally WebKit recommended it, and then Mozilla improved upon it, made it a little more succinct, and that's what the W3C officially recommends. So we'll do that one as well. So next I'm going to do a little bit more, and we're going to apply some padding all around the input. I'm going to add a highlight border, because if you come in, you'll see that if we zoom in very closely, there's a border that goes all around this input, and it's that color right there. So if we come back, we're going to set that as a border all around. I'm going to make sure that the input color is white, and I'm also going to push it to the left, and that'll give it some spacing from the search text. And now if I refresh, ta-da, we get some nice looking text right there. Very cool. So with very little effort, we've been able to create a nice looking header. It still needs a bit of work, but we've added some cool transitions for the browsers that support them. One thing is, notice these social links. Why don't we add a border? And this will give me a chance to show you something interesting. If we go back to the head social section, and when you hover over the image, why don't we apply a border of 1 pixel solid white? Now watch what happens. Refresh it. If I hover over it, you get that border, but it's being sliced off. And also, we're getting some positioning issues where if you watch the Facebook icon, it'll push to the left, and that's because, again, we're adding 2 more pixels worth of spacing here, and we could use some negative margins to fix that, but it's just kind of confusing. So another way, you would think, is to use the outline property. Now, this is supported in IE 7+, and what that will do is provide an outline. But you'll see right here, the problem is outline can't be rounded. It's not going to support that. So you'll see that doesn't look very good either. So one cool technique that I'll show you is to use box shadow. So you might be thinking, well, we don't need a shadow here. Right, but you can create shadows that'll be displayed as colors, and there's a lot of cool techniques for them. So let's do Moz box shadow. And the first parameter is going to be the X offset, so how much blur to the right. The next one's going to be the Y-axis. The third parameter is going to be the amount of blur. And the fourth parameter is going to be the spread. So let's set the fourth parameter to 1 pixel. And then if we set the first 3 to 0, we're saying no X offset, no Y, no blur, just add some spread. So let's see what happens when we do that. And let's copy this and also duplicate it for WebKit as well, so that we can view it in Chrome. Now if I hover over it, you get a cool looking outline. So let's change that, and we'll do white. Hover over it, and now we get kind of a cool little effect. If we go into Firefox and view it, you can see that even in Firefox it's not going to be the same because Firefox only supports transitions as of Firefox 4. But you still get this kind of background glow that I think looks neat in itself as well. Now the last thing that we're going to do before we finish up for today's lesson is zoom out a bit, and you see how there's this search icon? So we want to grab that. So I'll go to my selector tool, and I had group before, but you guys in the comments are very smart. Let's make sure we select the layer specifically. And now that'll go directly to the search icon. So I'm going to copy that, and you see how it has some effects here? If I hit Shift-Command-C, it'll make sure it copies that. And now if I paste it in, zoom in, and if I set a background color, you can see what we're working with there. So let's undo that and save it for the web as a ping 24 because there will be transparency. And when you have transparent backgrounds, use the ping 24. So here we'll call it search icon, like so. So I'll hide this and come back, and now we're going to use a cool technique. Now this technique, I need to warn you, is only available in some of the latest browsers, like the current version of Firefox and Chrome, and this is multiple backgrounds. So if we go into our form and go into input, we already have this background right here. Well, watch what happens if we say background image is URL, go into the images folder and get search icon.png, set it to no repeat. And now we do a comma, and that'll separate the differences. Now we also need to position it, so why don't we say 100% to the right and 0% from the top, or maybe 48% from the top. Now that's not going to show by default, but let's get rid of image because we can still use gradients like so. If I refresh now, you can see that in addition to the icon, we're also using the background right there. Pretty cool. So now let's just tune it a bit. We'll do 98%. Yeah, and that looks good. So now we're using some of the latest techniques to add just some extra enhancements of adding an icon there. Before, you would have had to do maybe an additional element, like create an additional span and then set this as the background of the span and then position that, but this is a much cleaner way. But in order to do this, we need to make sure that we also apply this right here. So grab it and then do it here as well. So now let's go into Firefox, refresh the page, and Firefox gets it, but IE will just display actually none of this. So IE will come to this, get that background color, and it won't display any gradients, but big deal. IE will be just fine with solid background colors. Okay, and now we are pretty much officially done with our header. We need to do custom fonts here, and we might tune it a little bit more, but we're getting there. So this is the first lesson, and stay tuned for the next section where we work on that huge banner area.